welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another deeper dive into the archive. I'm taking a look at the Circus Hall of Fame today that used to be in Sarasota. Opening in 1956, it welcomed visitors until 1980. Today I'll tell its story, how it came to be built, why it was in Sarasota, and why it closed. Along the way, you'll see the exhibits, images, and videos of performances, its 10th anniversary TV special, and I'll even explore the various ways that the attraction was associated with the worst day in American circus history. The Circus Hall of Fame was located on US 41 north of Sarasota. Nearby was the airport and the land upon which new College of Florida would be built. Directly to the south is the Ringling Museum complex. The Circus Hall of Fame was far from just a simple museum. Much like the baseball or rock and roll halls of fame, it contained thousands of objects connected with the circus, as well as the women and men who put their blood, sweat, and tears into the many unique circuses in the past 200 years. That time between the end of World War II and the opening of Walt Disney World in 1971. That's not to suggest anything negative about Disney World. People like to blame it for the demise of the smaller so-called mom-and-pop roadside attractions, but there were a number of reasons that Florida tourism was changing. Florida has always been a dynamic place, and with tourism being such a huge part of the economy, it's inevitable that there were major changes. The Hall of Fame joined a list of attractions that dotted the Gulf of Mexico from Crystal River south to Naples. Many, like the Hall of Fame, sat on U.S. Route 41, Tamiami Trail. Like U.S. Route 1 on the Atlantic coast and U.S. Route 27 along the center of the state, U.S. 41 was a main way for visitors to explore from the 1930s to the 1960s. Contained in a 7-building complex, the Hall of Fame had room for a collection of artifacts and performance areas. Its most prominent building was the Glass House, a 2-story structure. The rest of the buildings make a rectangle with a large field in the center that was about 1 acre or 4,500 square meters. The field had an outdoor circus ring set up for shows, as well as various displays such as circus wagons. Sarasota had long been the winter home of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, and there were a number of prominent retirees and fans in the area. 2 were John L. Sullivan and Dr. H. Chester Hoyt, who in the 1950s were the curators of the Museum of the Circus, part of the Ringling Museums. Sullivan and Hoyt had their own memorabilia collections, and they decided to develop a new circus attraction featuring personal effects from famous circus artists and workers, including costumes, props, and posters, as well as wagons and other large pieces that were part of historic circus companies. The Hall of Fame also presented circus acts several times a day in both indoor and outdoor circus rings. It's said that the Hall of Fame was created for one special object above all others. Named the Two Hemispheres Bandwagon, it was owned by another local, Dr. Bartlett Joshua Palmer. During World War II, he purchased the long-neglected bandwagon and eventually offered it to Sullivan and Hoyt. A few years after the Hall of Fame opened, its managing director, Colonel W. W. Merrimore, confirmed that the bandwagon was the primary motive for the museum, a fact strengthened by being placed in the front windows. This is a quote from the book Singing Wheels and Circus Wagons by Gene Plowden. Published in 1977, to me, it's the most authoritative source on circus wagons. The wagon measures 28 feet in length, 7 feet 11 inches wide at the center, and 10 feet 6 inches high. Wheels in front are 42 inches in diameter, the rear wheels 48 inches. They're fitted with steel rims. It has been proclaimed the largest parade wagon ever built. Some authorities dispute this, pointing out a thing called the Chariot of India was reported to be 35 feet long. Anyway, the Two Hemispheres was loaded with covered medallions representing nations of the Eastern and Western Hemispheres, and all were beautifully executed. Because it was more than 20 feet long, the mammoth wagon was designated 142 and 143 for loading and unloading, but it was commonly known as the Two Hems, or simply the Hem. In the 1903 and 1904 street parades, the wagon was drawn by a 40-horse hitch, but in 1905 and thereafter, hitches of 12 and 24 horses were used. The wagon weighs 13,000 pounds and holds 17 band members and 2 drivers. As you can see from the posters, it was the star of the Barnum and Bailey parade held in every town visited. At the time, circus parades were as big an event as actual circus performances. Plus, they were enjoyed by everyone for free. The Two Hems is one of the most famous circus wagons in American history. While there were a number of other large and beautiful wagons, there is no question that this was the most dramatic. It was bigger than life and had a theme that included the earth. Still, like so much connected with the circus, there was as much hyperbole as fact. For example, it initially was pulled by 40 horses, yet in later years as few as 8 were hitched to the wagon. Still, you'll see information that said that it required 40. As you can see on the 1903 poster, it states that the wagon and team cost $50,000. Other places, including Hall of Fame publications, it said it cost $40,000. The reality is that circus historian Fred Dallinger, the curator of circus history with the Ringling Museum of Art, has stated that it cost only $4,200. Still, that would have bought a rather fancy house in 1902. There's so much more to say about the Two Hems, I just simply don't have the time here. Luckily, it still exists, and I'll get to that at the end of the video. So why did Sarasota become the home for both the Hall of Fame and the Museum of the Circus? Well, it's an interesting story. Let me jump back to the early 19th century. Traveling circuses were developing, performing outdoors. Alongside the circuses, P.T. Barnum had opened the American Museum in New York City, filled with valid scientific displays as well as odd, weird, and even grotesque items. By the end of the Civil War, Barnum's museum had burned down twice. And so in 1870, he joined up with William Coop and Dan Costello to form Barnum's Museum, Menagerie, and Circus. While it wasn't the first circus, it's thought to be the first to travel by rail, and the first to have multiple rings, creating the three-ring circus. In 1880, Barnum joined with James Bailey in the Barnum and Bailey Circus. It was the first time that the greatest show on earth appears to be used. Barnum and Bailey was remarkably successful, continuing on after Barnum's death in 1891. At the same time, a new circus was begun in Wisconsin by 5 of 7 Ringling brothers. Within a few years, these 2 circuses were the largest in the country. Bailey died in 1906, and the Ringlings purchased Barnum and Bailey from the estate. For 12 years, they operated 2 complete traveling shows. By 1919, only 2 of the Ringlings were still alive, and Charles and John decided that running 2 shows was too hard. That's how we got the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus combined shows. They continued to buy circuses to guarantee that they were the predominant company in the nation. Charles and Edith Ringling began wintering in Sarasota in 1896, with John and Mabel Ringling following a few years later. Both brothers helped to develop the city and in 1927 made it their circus winter headquarters. This is an issue of Life magazine from 1946 that introduced Ringling's winter quarters, showing performers who entertained the thousands of visitors who came to the circus instead of the circus going to them. In 1960, New College was established on Charles and Edith's former property, preserving much of the original estate. Next door was John and Mabel's estate, which John willed to the state of Florida. Its Ringling family history, along with the Ringling Winter Quarters and Ringling Museums, made Sarasota one of the most important circus towns in the U.S., ample reason as to why it became the home of the Circus Hall of Fame. The city has other tourism attractions, some of the best beaches in Florida, 2 wonderful botanical gardens, the the venerable Sarasota Jungle Gardens and Marie Selby Gardens. Together, they offer a wonderful day's exploration of tropical and subtropical plants. The city was also the site of one of the first auto museums, known as Horn's Cars of Yesterday and later as Bellum's Cars and Music of Yesterday. Today, the Sarasota Classic Car Museum continues the legacy, though I'm afraid it isn't the equal of the past attractions. Still, it has many interesting vehicles, including ones owned by the Ringlings. Now back to the Hall of Fame and some of its exhibits. This sleigh was given to the singer Jenny Lind by P.T. Barnum in 1850. Barnum was in Sweden at the time and thought her singing voice would be a hit in America. He brought her over to the U.S., sleigh and all. The problem was no one knew who she was, but Barnum was a master of promotion, and more than 100 years before Beatlemania, the press dubbed her runaway popularity Lindmania. Billed as the Swedish Nightingale, Lind and Barnum earned nearly $1 million with a tour running a couple of years. During the tour and for many years after, she donated money to many charities in the U.S. as well as funding schools and hospitals in Sweden. The next popular display is another connection to Barnum. This is a carriage that was presented to Charles Stratton by the British Queen Victoria. Stratton was another of Barnum's discoveries, publicly appearing by the name General Tom Thumb, given to him by Barnum as a reference to the popular English fairy tale. Stratton was one of the smallest performers in American history. He started performing at the age of 15 when he stood just 26 inches or 65 centimeters tall. He was a sensation. He learned to perform with skills in acting, singing, and doing impersonations. His appearances changed the nature of the freak show, then considered disreputable, but his talents were such that many wealthy and important people wanted to see him. In 1844, he was presented to Queen Victoria. The carriage dates to a decade later and is 38 inches or a meter high and 77 inches or just under 2 meters long. It was so small that it was actually a snug fit for Stratton. He did continue to grow, and topped out at 42 inches or a little over a meter in height. He remained a popular performer throughout his life and became quite wealthy. Sadly, he died of a stroke at the age of 45, but he's still one of the most famous little people in history. Other Hall of Fame displays included this handmade miniature circus, created by dedicated modeler Wally Smith. There was a series of operating amusement ride models. There was also a large display of model railroad trains that represented the 106 rail cars the Ringling Brothers Circus owned. For decades, they carried everything the circus needed: performers, staff, their living quarters, the animals, all equipment including banners, wagons, riggings, and even a bank car that dealt with the thousands of dollars taken in for every show and paid out to the staff, local vendors, and the occasional bribe of a greedy sheriff. The Hall of Fame had a large room filled with historic puppets and a theater for puppet shows. They held 4 shows daily by some of the best puppeteers. The attraction had 2 other performance areas. One was located in the center field. It's where the large animals performed, such as horses. Or big cats. It's also where some acrobats performed. At special times, they even put up a traditional circus tent. The other theater was indoors, had seating for 200, and showed other animal acts, clowns, and skilled acts. Located in the southernmost building, it was named the Pat Valdo Arena. Valdo was one of the longest employees of the Ringling Brothers Circus. Around the age of 16, he joined the circus and within a few years apprenticed to become a clown. He joined the Ringling Circus in about 1902 and grew to become one of the best-known clowns. Ringling even used Valdo's face on posters, and he created some of the routines that circus clowns perform to this day. He was promoted to assistant ringmaster, and later John Ringling named him the director of performer personnel. He retired 40 years later and was given the title of director emeritus of the circus. Sadly, he died the next year. Many performers worked at the Hall of Fame. A number of the acts are pictured in Hall of Fame souvenir booklets, brochures, and on its postcards. One was Bobo the Clown, who taught about costumes, makeup, and props. He also performed at the Hall of Fame. This is a series of photos where he interacts with aerialist Carmen del Molino. These photos resulted in one of the attraction's popular postcards. Del Molino was known as the Queen of the Swinging Trapeze and was a favorite at the Hall of Fame. There was also the Rolling Globe artists, the Lacey family, who were originally from Hungary. There was a number of other clowns as well as Bobo. Then there were the animal acts. Simone's chimpanzees. Hilano's Poodle Review. And David Hoover's Lions and Tigers. At least 2 television specials were filmed there. One was the Circus Hall of Fame All-Star Circus, hosted by Ed McMahon. Filmed in 1970, there's little information on it. The second was filmed 4 years before and was hosted by Gary Moore. Shot in 1966, it was the first network TV show to originate from a circus museum. The production was so large that the inside field was nearly filled with a big top 100 by 200 foot or 30 by 61 meters in size. The massive tent was very much like the ones the Ringling Brothers Circus used decades before, with an audience of 3,000. Sadly, no footage of either show seems to be available. The 1966 show included the George Hannaford horse riding family, who were descended from a family who first performed as a traveling troupe in 1807. The Clyde Beatty Cole Brothers Circus Elephants with Eva and Rex Williams was there. the Flying Palacios Trapeze Group from Mexico, High Wire act Harold Elzana, Tarzan Zerbini's Lions, and Tagora the Fire Eater. The stars of the show, however, were a clown and famous high wire family. Even if you don't know much about the circus, you've likely heard about the Flying Wallendas, a family act that began in 1922. They were one of the most thrilling circus acts, earning top billing and high pay. They were famous for performing a dramatic pyramid stunt, often without a net stretched below. Their performance at the Hall of Fame came only a few years after tragedy struck the family not once, but twice. In 1962, they were performing in Detroit when the front man stumbled. The pyramid collapsed, and 2 men fell to their death with another paralyzed. A year later, another family member fainted and fell to her death. The clown was, like the Wallendas, a world-famous circus star. Emmett Kelly, who in these photos is rehearsing with host Gary Moore, was originally employed as a cartoonist, but he learned the trapeze and how to clown, and by the age of 23 was working in a circus. Early on, he developed a hobo character that became his trademark role for 58 years. At the same time, he continued with the trapeze in a team with his first wife, Eva Moore. Eventually, he stuck with clowning, and the Cole Brothers Circus called him the world's funniest clown. By 1942, Kelly was with the Ringling Brothers Circus, where he'd first interact with the Flying Wallendas. While they performed, he stood holding out a handkerchief to catch them if they fell. It provided a sense of humorous relief to the extraordinarily dangerous act. Kelly appeared in movies and on TV and remained busy as a featured performer throughout the rest of his life. He moved to Sarasota, where he stayed close to his circus roots. He died there at the age of 80. This is what's known as a route book. Published at the end of a circus's company's season, they gave an account of the year. They were sold to performers and staff from that season and sometimes to circus fans. They had a list of the personnel, stories, photos, and stats which listed miles traveled, the railroads used, length of the season, amount of canvas and rope, and more. Cities visited are listed, including the railroad used and possibly attendance. This route book is from 1944, and while it has nothing directly to do with the Hall of Fame, it's relevant to this overall story. Showing the Ringling Brothers Circus, it mentions several of the performers I've talked about who are working with the circus. It shows Pat Valdo as manager, as well as Emmett Kelly and the Flying Wallendas. This was during the time that Kelly did that handkerchief bit. It also lists a number of other performers I showed in the Life magazine article from '46. Longtime fans of the circus will know why the year 1944 is important, and while the Life article makes no mention of it, it's discussed in the route book. July 6, 1944 is known as the worst day in American circus history. It was the day Ringling Brothers suffered the Hartford Circus fire. 80 years have passed, and it's still one of the 10 deadliest building fires in American history. The circus had set up in Hartford, Connecticut, having come from Rhode Island. They arrived late on the 5th and were only able to fit in one of 2 shows that day, giving many in the company a sense of dread because missing a show was considered bad luck. On the 6th, the first show began at 2:15. No one knows how many were in the audience, but the tent could fit 9,000 and an educated guess was around 7,000. And due to the war, they were mostly moms and kids. Starting the show was the first animal act, Alfred Cort's Wild Cats, appearing in all 3 rings, with Cort in the center and Harry and May Kovar and Fritz Schultz working the other 2. The big cats entered through chutes from cages outside. The chutes were placed in emergency exits on the north side.
As the big cats were finishing, the next act had entered and were climbing the rope ladders. This was the Flying Wallendas. Witnesses said that it was in the transition between the two acts that the fire was noticed in the tent. One attendee was quoted as saying, "As I turned my gaze away from the cage and slightly to my right, the second act was almost ready, the Flying Wallendas. Some were already up on the south side with bikes that would balance on wires strung across the tent. The others were up on the north side, our side. While watching the last of the Wallendas climb the ladder, in that same glance, I saw almost directly behind him on the opposite tent wall what looked like a full moon just as it comes into view above the horizon, and just about the same size. I had no idea what it was. It climbed slowly. Then someone said, 'Fire.' The blaze began at the west end. No one knows what or who started it. Two main theories were arson and a carelessly thrown cigarette. When the canvas caught, there was no chance of putting it out. The thick cotton tents were coated with a mixture of paraffin wax and gasoline. The result is a great water repellent, but it's as flammable as anything. Helen Wallenda was up on the platform preparing to begin the act with her sister Henrietta and 3 others. The entrance was to her right. Henrietta said, 'Look,' and she saw the fire about 2 foot wide on the canvas. As she watched, the fire spread to the roof. Helen's husband, Carl Wallenda, motioned from the other side of the tent for them to get down. The family slid down ropes to escape. Helen tried to get out of the nearest exit, but she was caught in the crowd that was pushing along to the east exit. Helen received some bruises from being stepped on, but survived along with the rest of the family. Since the fire happened after Court's animal show, the steel animal tunnels were in place, and that's where many of the deaths occurred. Panicked spectators piled up in the tunnels with people being crushed by others. The number of deaths is officially 168, but the true amount is likely higher due to free passes and the inconclusive way the fatalities were estimated. Some died due to burns, but most were trampled in the panic or died jumping off the grandstands. Alfred Court later blamed the safety code. He felt the size and distribution of the exits was bad and complained about how narrow the corridors were. Aside from the fire, his staff had barely enough room, putting them at risk for being mauled by the cats as they moved them back and forth. Apart from the Wallendas, people I've talked about were survivals, including these in the Winter Quarters article. I haven't been able to discover where Pat Valdo was during the fire, but as director of performers, he'd have been extremely busy in the aftermath. The clown, Lou Jacob, had left Hartford on a bus earlier in the day to visit his brother in New York, and didn't learn about the fire until listening to the radio the next morning. As for Emmett Kelly, he'd already put on his clown face and costume and was thought to be ready to enter the Big Top for his appearance with the Wallendas. Some say the top took only 10 minutes to be consumed. Aerial photos showed the canvas turn to ash, and with the fire burning so quickly, it didn't destroy all that much else. Kelly ended up featured in the most famous photograph of the day, Weary Willie, carrying a water-filled bucket in front of bleachers and with heavy smoke still in the air. Published in Life magazine, millions of Americans saw the photo taken by Ralph Emerson, who was just one of the 7,000 audience members. This photo shows the aftermath, and I've rotated it to make it a little bit easier to understand. On the right side, you can see onlookers, and somewhat prophetically, the business just above was a gravestone maker. The tent site shows the seats directly facing the rings destroyed, not by fire, but by the collapsed tent poles. This was reserved seating. On the ends were bleachers for general admission, which were largely untouched. You can see the remains of the cages and the animal chutes in this photo. All the animals survived, as did all the performers I've talked about. There's one other connection with the Hall of Fame. One of those 3 rings was used in the Pat Valdo Arena in Sarasota. This is the site today with a memorial in the center, 80 years on from what became known as the day the clowns cried. Ringling Brothers headed back to Sarasota 9 days later to regroup, but the show must go on. Less than a month after the fire, the circus performed in Akron, Ohio, this time with a new purpose. All profits for the next decade of shows were compensation to the victims of the Hartford Circus fire. Back to more recent events. By 1980, the popularity of the Hall of Fame had dwindled to a point where it couldn't cover its costs. In the 1970s, circuses weren't all that popular. On top of that, in 1974, Ringling Brothers opened a theme park near Disney World, Circus World, an attraction with thrill rides and circus performers. If people wanted the circus experience on vacation, they could choose that. The Hall of Fame closed in 1980 after a run of 24 years. By the way, Circus World closed in 1986, operating just half that time. Following the closing of the Hall of Fame, John Zweifel purchased everything but the building. In 1981, a group of citizens from Peru, Indiana, learned that the collection was yet again for sale, and they felt it vital to preserve the collection as a whole, for if it was sold off in small lots, much of it would disappear into private collections, and the history of the American Circus would be more difficult to tell. The people of Indiana, along with businesses and the state, raised the funds to purchase it. Brought from Florida to Peru, it was housed in the former Wallace Circus winter quarters, one of the other great historic circus locations. The buildings, built by the American Circus Corporation in 1922, are designated as National Historic Landmarks. The Sarasota collection was the start of what became the International Circus Hall of Fame. Today, a museum filled with circus artifacts, costumes, circus posters, photographs and films, route books, and circus wagons. All of this is found inside the historic buildings. While much of the Hall of Fame's collection was included in the sale, some significant parts were excluded, including the 2 hems. It went to auction in 2016 and sold for $250,000. Purchased by Canadian circus historian Peter Gorman, who's on the board of the International Circus Hall of Fame, he brought the bandwagon to the Hall of Fame for the first winter. It was later shown in other cities, but as of 2025, it's locked in a warehouse in French Lick, Indiana. As for the Sarasota Hall of Fame, the buildings were removed and the property is currently owned by the state of Florida. Since it's located next to New College, it's used as a park by students and locals. There's a soccer field and batting cages.
While it's a shame that Sarasota lost the Hall of Fame, it's wonderful that the collection is intact and is in a museum that has support outside of ticket sales. Those important historical documents and artifacts shouldn't be placed in some sort of popularity jeopardy. The new Hall of Fame is open throughout the summer months and is always looking for volunteers to help with restoration and maintenance. I'll put their website in the notes. Please check it out. An important part of Florida's tourism history is preserved there. Thank you for watching another of my videos. I hope you enjoyed it. If you learned something, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more on Florida's tourism history. And please check out my Patreon account. I'd really appreciate it. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.